let me just pick up right away on what Patricia said was, in Asheville, I noticed just last week, your book and my book were both listed in Publishers Weekly as the books that are coming out this week.
Yeah.
And which is awesome. But it's really, I mean, what are the odds of two books being from Asheville, North Carolina on that list? It's amazing.
Yeah.
So what do you think's in the water here in Asheville? There's so many authors you can't spit without hitting one.
No, it's the truth. I mean, we do have a pretty rich storytelling tradition here in Western North Carolina, but we're also, we're just blessed to have this, really thriving creative community. I mean, writers, artists, all sorts of crafts people. And I think, we're so lucky to get to live here and be able to, have such a satisfying community of creators. That's one of the best parts of my writing, but also of working at Malaprop, because it's such a hub for all of those people. So we're really lucky.
It may have something to do too with anymore. You can be a writer and live anywhere. You don't have to be in New York or Boston.
Absolutely. Internet connection is all you need, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're in Asheville.
I'm glad you are too. I really appreciate you doing this with me tonight too, Allan. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm just really pleased that you wrote this book. And for those of you who are just joining us at home, it's In the Shadow of the Moon. And it tells you all the things that you don't know. You thought you knew what was going on with the race to the moon. And you may have heard of Sputnik, but that's about it. And this book tells you all the dirt. And there's a lot of it, and there's a lot to cover here. There's a lot of research, I know, and I know a lot of people out there want to know how you did the research. We're going to get to that. I just wanted y'all to know that we're going to kind of talk in stages, because that's what rocket people do. Amy's book is in stages. I noticed you put it in stages. There's three main stages. There's rockets, satellites, and the moon. And those are that's the basic layout of the book. One level leads to another. Just like the stages of a rocket, that's how they got there.
Right.
But the guys that started this, and Amy will tell us about the two main architects behind all this, they started out with their eye on the moon. And I think that's very telling right there. And, I just like to open it up, Amy, because I'd like for you to sort of tell in your own words what the heart of this story is. I've already told people it's basically you've got Russia and the United States.
Yeah.
And you've got the two main scientists, Werner von Braun, and you got Sergei Korolev.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the book, and maybe even let that segue into a passage that you might share with us.
Sure. I would love to talk about it. I have been a lifelong space flight enthusiast. I was a child who grew up in the 1970s and 80s when the classroom stopped whenever a space shuttle was launching and landing. And I've always been fascinated by space. I've always been fascinated by, I love stories about science the way I love stories about sports. I'm not a sports fan, but I love sports stories. And I'm not a scientist. I do not have the math skills to be a scientist, but I love science stories because more often than not, they are set against someone trying to overcome, a law of the universe, to cure a disease. By definition, it almost makes the scientist part of something that's larger than themselves. And I've been lucky enough to interview a number of folks who worked at NASA for my book about hurricanes and drones. And it's amazing to me how many people would say, I started this job because I wanted to be a part of something larger than myself. And there's so much nobility in that, but it's also just a practical fact of these people's lives. They just, that's the way it was with von Braun and Korolov. From the time that they were small children, they dreamed of flight. They were both pilots. They both dreamed of going to the moon, but they were audacious enough to believe that it was actually possible. And
Right.
that's where the difference really comes in, because it's one thing to to dream of going to the moon and to fantasize about going to Mars. It's quite another thing to sit down and want to do the math and actually figure out how to build a machine that would accomplish this larger than life thing. That was something that always drew me to stories about space flight in general. But I was really humbled by the fact that I didn't know nearly as much about the history of space flight as I thought I did. And like many Americans, I know the very American story. There is nothing more, mom and apple pie than the moon landing. I mean, it defined the world. It defined us as Americans, and it made us. It very much helped, augment our status as a superpower. And so when I started looking into the space race and realized that there were a lot of things I didn't know, I was humbled, but I was also, as a writer, just completely preoccupied by curiosity. And it all sparked one night. I was trying to decide what book I was going to write next, and I had the television on, and I was nodding off, and I heard the narrator say that the architect of the moon landing had been a former Nazi. And I didn't sit bolt upright, but it just lodged in my brain, and I thought, that I'm half asleep, that can't be right. And the next morning I woke up, I was like, I have really got to dig into that. I surely I would have known this. And surely I didn't. I went looking and discovered Wernher von Braun, and that he had been a former Nazi, that he was this wonderkind physicist, and he was just audacious enough to believe that he could do these incredible things. But the more I dug into his background, the more I had to accept the hard truth that I was going to have to make peace with my version of the very American story of the moon landing. And that, of course, led me to ask more questions. I thought, well, if I didn't know this about the American side of the story that's so important to me, what don't I know about the Soviet side of the story? And that's where the whole space race just came alive for me. And I just embarked on this obsessive quest to understand it and to bring that story to young readers. I wanted that quest story, but I also wanted this reconciliation with the hard parts of the past.
Awesome. And that's going to be stage 2, is where we talk about propaganda versus progress.
Yeah.
And one of our later stages, maybe it'll come earlier, is the big elephant in the room is the Nazi who got us to the moon.
That's
and
right.
What does that mean? And
right.
to us as a people who are trying to make progress in science and health and politics and humanity's place in the world, what are we willing to look away from in order to make the larger progress here? And I'd love to hear you also kind of talk about, you got to do this for young people.
Yeah.
And this is your first novel for teenagers. You've been writing for middle grades.
Yeah.
Here's your first novel for teenagers. What makes it a little bit easier, you don't have to pull as many punches. Right. But I'd kind of like to direct you, before you really get into von Braun, let's hear something, because we've heard in the background that he's straight from the Nazis, from Nazi Germany. One person we know absolutely nothing about is the man who was his counterpart in the Soviet Union at the time. We don't know him because they kept his name a secret.
That's right.
So can you launch into that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. I'm fascinated by the life and times of Sergei Korolev. And before I go on, I should say anyone who is interested in reading more about these two world-changing rocket engineers should definitely look at the work of Asif Siddiqui. He's a professor of history at Fordham University, and Michael Neufeld. He is a historian emeritus at the Air and Space Museum, and he has written an incredible biography of von Braun. So they're really great places to go if you want to dig into the story a little deeper. But I started reading about Sergei, as blown away as I was by von Braun's story and the complexity of his character and how that factored into the success of the Apollo missions. When I stumbled on Sergei Korolev, I realized that there was not only a whole side of the story that I didn't know, but a whole side of the story that I'd never even bothered to think about. We won the space race. It's a very American-centric moment. And when I started looking into Korolev's life and accomplishments and what he endured, it takes the entire story of the space race to another level. There's all this context there that I just found fascinating and important as we think about going to Mars and beyond by the 2030s. There are a lot of lessons there that I think not only young readers, but especially future scientists can consider. But Sergei Korolev, like von Braun, dreamed of traveling to the moon when he was a young boy. He came from a broken home, and he spent a lot of time with his grandparents, and he was kind of a lonely kid. He was really smart. His family wanted him to have a trade and have a practical job. They wanted him to learn a trade, and he learned. He did that to satisfy his family, but he also built gliders, and he joined a band of as he grew older. When he was a teenager, he joined a group of local rocket enthusiasts, and they started firing their own rockets. He eventually went to school and pursued spaceflight academically. And when he completed his schooling, he went to work building rockets for Russia. And his life was going pretty well. And then Stalin's purges began. And Stalin's purges were horrible in that millions and millions of innocent Russians were unfairly incarcerated, made to work in horrific gulag camps, some of which bordered the Arctic Circle, digging gold for Stalin. And Korolev was swept up in Stalin's purges and was wrongly accused and imprisoned in a Soviet gulag, and spent years there until Stalin realized that his country was going to need a rocket as well if it was going to compete with von Braun, who had been recruited by the Americans. And in a stunning display of hypocrisy, taps Korolev, his former prisoner, into building the first Russian rocket. So I think I'll read a little bit about the night of Korolev's arrest. Awesome. This was one of the most chilling stories of the deep history of the space race that I never knew. This is from chapter 6. It's called An Innocent Traitor. A dark new moon rose over Moscow as 31-year-old Sergei Korolev walked home from work to the apartment he shared with his wife, Senia, a medical student. The dark-eyed, barrel-chested Russian was an engineer at a top-secret rocket research facility, the Reactive Scientific Research Institute in Moscow. Korolev developed missiles for the Soviet government. It was thrilling to work with new technology, but it was a dangerous time for every Soviet citizen. Some of his colleagues at the Institute were disappearing, and Korolev feared he could be next. Joseph Stalin, the country's paranoid communist dictator, was determined to eliminate political rivals at any cost. At that time, the Soviet Union, like Hitler's Germany, was an authoritarian state. In an authoritarian society, extreme secrecy dominates every aspect of life, isolating its people from the outside world and concealing crimes committed by their ruler. Stalin, like Hitler, was in complete control. People were encouraged to spy on one another and report any anti-Soviet activity. Since 1936, Stalin's brutal secret police force, the NKVD, had begun arresting Soviet citizens on false or fabricated charges. It was a period of rampant arrests known as the Great Terror, during which Stalin sought to eliminate his enemies by incarcerating millions of innocent Soviet citizens. Without a trial or proof of guilt, anyone could be detained. There were whispers of people being abducted on the street and never heard from again. Most were wrongfully imprisoned in an elaborate system of labor camps known as the Gulag. Between 1929 and 1953, this network of barbed wire labor camps and guard towers spanned the length and width of the Soviet Union and detained approximately 18 million people. Stalin's plan was twofold. He would remove his political enemies while simultaneously creating a prison labor force. Anyone he believed threatened his leadership or contradicted his authority was jailed. The prisoners farmed the land and mined the Soviet Union's rich mineral reserves. Stalin needed the gold trapped beneath the frozen Siberian tundra to trade with the West for technology and equipment to modernize his country. No one was safe, not even the Soviet Union's greatest scientific minds. Sergei Korolev was already a suspect. One of his colleagues at the Institute, a brilliant rocket engineer named Valentin Glushko, had been accused of consorting with enemies of the people and deemed untrustworthy with military secrets. In March, the NKVD had arrested him. While other co-workers denounced Glushko in order to escape arrest, Korolev refused to lie and defended his colleague, a brave and selfless act that made him a target as well. Hurrying along that summer evening, Korolev paused to buy a copy of Pravda, the official Soviet newspaper, and to pick up a loaf of French bread for supper. The couple would dine alone that night, as their only child, 3-year-old Natalia, was visiting her grandmother. Later, it would prove fortunate that she had not been home. Korolev climbed the stairs to the 6th floor and opened the door of their one-room apartment. Xenia was still at work. Sometime later, she arrived, nervous and afraid. There were men downstairs, she said. They were dressed in dark suits, asking questions and interviewing their neighbors. They looked like NKVD officers. The arrival of the infamous black NKVD vehicles, known as the Black Ravens, filled everyone with dread. Some of the building's tenants had already been arrested. There was no way to be certain who they had come for this time, but Stalin's enforcers never left empty-handed. After supper, Sergei and Xenia listened to music on their phonograph and waited. The doorbell rang. Korolev opened the door and saw 2 NKVD officers, each carrying a semi-automatic Tokarev pistol. One of the men flashed official-looking credentials. They stepped inside and ordered Korolev to sit down. When the NKVD entered the home of a suspected traitor, they tore through drawers, tossed furniture, and smashed anything that got in their way. Sentimental heirlooms crashed to the floor as they searched for papers, diaries, and scraps of circumstantial evidence that might incriminate the accused. The police found nothing suspicious in the Korolev's apartment, but they arrested Sergei anyway. He did not resist as he pulled on his old leather coat. Xenia was desperate. She couldn't imagine where these men were taking her husband or how long he would be gone. I naively gave him 2 changes of underwear for the journey, she remembered years later. We said goodbye and kissed each other. At the window, she waited for one last glimpse of Sergei as the police led him to their car. She had no idea it was the last time she would see her husband for 6 years. I had golden hair, she later said. It went completely gray overnight. So that was a traumatic moment, a life-changing moment for them. There's an incredible documentary series I watched, and they actually take an aging Xenia back to the apartment building where they lived, and she's telling the documentarians about it. And years, I mean, they divorced, he remarried, it's decades later, and the trauma just comes right back to her in that moment. She cries. It's heart-wrenching. We can't imagine what it must have been like to have lived during that time.
It's important to remember that these were all human beings. They were people.
Yeah.
They were moms and dads.
That's right.
They would react the way that anybody would react.
Yeah.
In these situations. It's so easy to read history books and not remember that these were all people.
That's right.
This is an awesome counterpart. The man who becomes the architect of the space program in Russia is a complete, that's a counterpart to what we see happening in the United States with Werner von Braun.
That's right.
Who starts off not as a prisoner, but as somebody who utilizes prisoners in order to do his research. So why don't you give us a little lowdown of, now we're going back, we're at the United States.
Yeah.
And I hope this sort of leads into our discussion about propaganda and how in the heck does a person who is a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party,
that's right,
and working on a missile program using prisoners of war who are dying by the thousands in the factory.
Absolutely.
How is it that he even gets to the United States?
Yeah.
What happened? There must be some sort of shenanigans there.
There were definitely shenanigans. At the end of World War II, Werner von Braun was one of the most wanted men in the world. Everyone knew he was the architect of the V-2 rocket. This was an incredible weapon of mass destruction that Hitler had tried to use in the last months of the war to defeat the Allies, but he was unsuccessful because he was already losing terribly. And von Braun, the rockets that von Braun had designed, the Nazis manufactured them in an abandoned gypsum mine in a concentration camp called Dora Mittelbau in central Germany. And von Braun did not work at the concentration camp. He was not on site with the prisoners every day. There's no evidence that he ever injured one of these prisoners. But von Braun's greatest crime seems to be that he was so obsessed with his rocket that he just didn't care all that much. This is one of the things that makes him fascinating to write about, because not everyone is all one thing, and not everyone is necessarily a hero or a villain. And this is what attracted me to von Braun, because his life is very complicated. And it led the United States to make some compromises that many people have argued were unforgivable compromises. There were former Nazis that were brought to the United States at the end of World War II under a top secret government program called Operation Paperclip. It was called Operation Paperclip because the German scientists that were selected to be brought into the United States to work in science and technology for the United States, their files were separated by a paperclip being placed on them. That's how they knew that that scientist had been, or engineer had been chosen, or technician had been chosen to come to the United States. And when von Braun was invited to come to the United States, it was because he had already surrendered to the Americans. He decided at the end of World War II that Hitler was going to lose, and that no matter what, his rocket research and his dreams of space travel were not going to burn with the rest of Germany. He was going to get out. And he and his colleagues, his closest associates, hatched a plan to betray Hitler and surrender to the Americans. And that's exactly what they did. They surrendered. And the Americans, the army and intelligence officials realized what a boon this was for potentially for American defense. They could get this guy into the United States and start building these incredible rockets for us. And they basically sneaked von Braun and a lot of these, hundreds of these other scientists into the country, kept them a secret for a while, and then gradually began this campaign of leaking, or not necessarily leaking, but publishing very carefully worded articles in local newspapers about von Braun and some of his associates. They have come to the United States to work from us. They rejected Hitler. They weren't ardent Nazis. They were just doing their job. That was sort of the party line. And because von Braun was so gifted, and we desperately wanted him to build weapons for us, we just sort of looked the other way. There were secrets that you'll read in the book that von Braun kept from intelligence officials that they may or may not have been aware of at the time he surrendered. But once he came to the United States, a massive propaganda campaign ballooned around von Braun. The intelligence officials and the Army were very interested in making sure that von Braun's image was pristine, especially later on when he started working on the space program. And one of the challenges in writing about von Braun was finding primary source material written by von Braun that wasn't cloaked in all of this propaganda, this shiny, he was extremely eloquent. He was very intelligent. He spoke multiple languages. He played multiple instruments. He was a very intellectual man, and he was incredibly self-aware. He knew that his image was everything, and that if he was going to take the United States to the moon someday, that he had to appear to be above reproach. So one of my challenges in writing about him was reading his primary documents, of course, but then finding very reliable secondary sources that could contextualize von Braun's life and work, because it was, you couldn't, all of his speeches, I read numerous speeches in the archives at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and they all sort of sound the same. He's very careful with how he chooses his words, and the United States was very careful in how they chose their words in describing von Braun and his work.
And even what I understand, John F. Kennedy didn't even know about his background. Even that was kept from Kennedy. So
yeah, parts of it were, yes. It was well known in the United States that von Braun had been a member of the Nazi Party, because to hold the position that he did in Germany as their premier architect for defense, it made sense that he would have been a member of the Nazi Party. But what was not made public was the fact that he had been a decorated officer in the SS.
Mm-hmm. And he had apparently been witness to some executions.
We don't know that he was witness to the executions, but we know that he knew of the conditions that were in the mine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And here we already are getting on gradations of guilt, right? And what we can accept in order to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. There's no easy answers to any of this. Do we turn and look the other way so that we can progress to something better, hopefully? Or do we stand our ground and just have zero tolerance?
Yeah.
And, if all of the scientists and great artists in the world had put their foot down and said, we are not going to be part of this, we would have lost them all.
Yeah.
And, is that an alternative? These are all really good questions.
Big questions. These are the questions that I want young readers to consider when they're, and lots of adults that I've spoken to throughout the writing of this book. These are parts of the story that they had never explored either. And I think that there are, it's worth all of us grappling with this uncomfortable information, especially as dependent as we are on technology, and as dependent as we are on these ideas of what it means to explore and to go to the moon. And as we start to take this next giant leap, it just seems incumbent upon us that we look back at the uncomfortable truth of how we got here, so that we don't make those same choices again.
I feel for you in that, I'm picking up on a question from Melissa who's asking,
Mhm.
how do you approach the role of anyone in the
Yeah.
Nazi Party to a readership? Your young people have a really limited understanding of the Holocaust.
Mhm.
Even if they think they know, they don't
Yeah.
really know.
Yeah.
And it's not a book about the Holocaust.
No.
And yet, so how do you balance that? How do you get
Yeah.
across how evil that was, that
Yeah.
background is
Yeah.
of von Braun with
Yeah.
these kids, and having, without it becoming a book about the Holocaust and explaining it?
Yeah.
How
Well,
do you balance it?
um, for me, this was always the story of two very complicated individuals um, striving to be part of something larger than themselves and making a lot of personal and uh, problematic choices along the way. And for me, in deciding how I was going to write about the Holocaust, it's an integral part of the deep history of the space race. The V2 is the great grandfather of the Saturn V rocket that took us to the moon.
Mhm.
And so the Holocaust is part and parcel of that. But for me, it was about showing readers plainly and simply. I wanted to take them inside that camp, inside that mine, and just show them what went on there. I read uh, uh, trial transcripts, and I read accounts from survivors. I went to an incredible museum when I was researching at the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. It's a memorial and a fabulous museum. And they actually had video installations of survivors, two gentlemen who had survived working in this horrible, underground rocket factory that was 42 degrees, even in the middle of summertime. And there were explosions. People fell to their death from scaffolding. You could be crushed. You could be, killed by a rival inmate, or the capos that were put in charge of policing these horrible, assembly lines inside. And so I thought if I could take readers in there and just show them what that looked like using those first person accounts, that would help them make the connection for themselves. I want young readers to draw these conclusions for themselves. It was very important for me to say to them, look, I want you to decide, what you would have done, or what you think maybe the United States should or shouldn't have done. I really wanted to I wanted to raise those questions and leave them for the readers to answer.
Was there anything that surprised you? This is kind of, I'm bouncing off of a question from
Yeah.
Janet on the chat. You went all the way to the other side of the world to actually be there.
Yep.
Was there anything that surprised you? Did anything blindside you?
Yes. Every bit of that trip blindsided me. From the incredible archives that I visited, and how dedicated the staffs of people are that work in these places, and that all you have to do is ask, and they bring cart after cart of incredible research material written in the. I looked at Walter Dornberger's papers. I looked at documents of von Braun's. That surprised me every day. But the most shocking part of my trip was certainly the visit to the concentration camp. And I had a very detailed itinerary of what I wanted to see when I was walking around that camp. And it was early spring. It was absolutely beautiful. It was deeply disturbing to know what that place was, and to look around. And the first thought I had was how beautiful it was. It was deeply unsettling. I toured the mine, the caves where they built the V2. They still smell like dust and metal. They're still dangerous to this day. You have to stay on this, narrow walkway with a fence, and over and over and over, our guide reminded us to watch our step and don't drop anything, because if you drop your camera or your phone down there, it's gone. There's no going after it. Um, and I couldn't bring myself to walk into the crematorium at the concentration camp, and I had very much planned on doing so. I felt like I owed it to these people that I was writing about, and I could not walk in the door. That really surprised me. It was, after spending the whole day there, it was just too much. It was one of the most profound experiences of my life, being in that place.
You mentioned in the back of the book how there is a column. You go to the site and there's an installment, two clear columns,
Mm-hmm.
and you can vote in one column or the other.
Yes.
And you're voting on whether you thought that it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do in order to progress in the way that we did scientifically in such a heinous way.
Yeah.
That was right.
Yeah, that was really surprising. At the Historical Technical Museum in Peenemünde. It's on the Baltic coast. It's where the Nazi, or the German army rather, built the world's first rocket factory for von Braun. And remnants of it are still there, and it's been converted into an incredible museum. And there's a display. I had toured the whole place, and this was one of my last stops. There's a small bust of von Braun, and then you turn, and opposite that, there are these clear acrylic cylinders about 3 feet tall. And there are paper discs there that look like restaurant drink coasters. And after you've toured this whole museum and they've shown you what the tension is between morality and technology as it relates to von Braun and the space race and technology in general, they ask visitors to assess for themselves whether they think von Braun was, whether he was just, someone caught up and obsessed in something that he wanted to accomplish, or if he was a villain. And that was what drove me to write the book in the first place. Was I was desperate to understand. And what I found most surprising was that the ballots, these drink coaster ballots that were dropped into these cylinders, were level on both sides. And it was maddening and revealing, and just sort of this perfect metaphor for the whole story. I couldn't have made it up. It was pretty powerful.
It is the perfect metaphor for it.
Yeah.
Do you mention that in the book, that they're even?
I can't remember.
I remember reading,
thinking,
I wonder which had more in it. And I thought maybe I just wasn't reading.
Yeah, I don't think I did. I really wanted readers to I leave that question for readers.
Yeah, it ends with the question, which one would you put it in?
Yeah. That's your vote. Yeah.
That last chapter, the final chapter in this book, by the way, is brilliant. It's
thank you.
It's an essay into itself. It's just awesome. It's awesome summation.
Thank you.
We have lots of great questions popping in here. And but to segue into those, because I think you might answer some of them, if I give you a general question about how, when you're putting a project like this together, when you're looking at history and you're finding all your facts, how do you take that much information? There's so much to talk about here just tonight. We've hit one stage of 5 stages.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to organize all that into an actual book? And you have 5 minutes to explain it.
All right. I will see what I can do. It took me 3 years to actually do it. Hopefully I can say how I did it in 5 minutes. I started where I think every good book starts, with character. And I just went on this obsessive reading binge, reading about these two people. And along the way, I encountered other people that informed the story. And I found other memoirs that they had written. And just for the first year, really, I just read and took notes. And one of the most valuable pieces of my research was this large, very messy document that was like this, it was like a rolling timeline that always seemed to grow in the middle. I kept trying to get to the moon landing, and it's like the middle just kept ballooning. But I took meticulous notes in my computer. I knew what my outline was. I knew the book started with, the V2 rocket and was going to end with the moon landing or a little bit after. And I took the basic, countdown of the moon landing and used that as sort of a general guide. But along the way, things got complicated and other parts of the story became important in ways that I hadn't thought about before. It was important to contextualize Von Braun's life when he moved to Huntsville, Alabama, because he and all the other Germans were, they had come to the United States. Some of them were former Nazis, not all of them were, but they arrived in Huntsville and, got loans from the local bank to buy houses and just sort of set up their lives. And this was in the Jim Crow era South. And, Black Americans that lived there at the time, they didn't have that. They didn't have that privilege. And so there were layers to the story. As you know, when you're writing, there's always something you intend to do, and there are more things that creep in to the story that you realize are just as important that you never could have anticipated. Right. So I tried to keep detailed notes by subject. I had, a Von Braun file, and I had a Korolov file, and I had a file for every stage of the Saturn program, and for Sputnik, and for the V2, and for all of the people that I was meeting along the way. And the great thing about this story is, I already knew it from the American side. So my challenge was daily to ask myself, what am I taking for granted about what I already know? And what have I found that upends that or complicates it? Or, as I hope, just makes the story much more interesting.
Right. Because you carry with you all your own biases.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think half of that, almost 90% of that research is vetting the documents, vetting what you have to read. Because most of them are 50% wrong anyway and have their own biases.
Yeah, that's right. So, that's why the work of anybody who wants to write a book like this, you have to find people who are experts already, who have done this research, particularly historians, because their entire job is to rewrite the record of history and get it right. And so that was really helpful to me to use those historical records as a counterpoint to all of those assumptions that I had and all of those blank spaces that I had in the Soviet program. I just didn't know anything about.
Well, I thought I could, as from the very beginning to the very end, I'm always reading for the heart of the thing, and we collect all of our information and all of our facts, and the reality springs from these facts, and we have a lot of freedom within the framework of reality and fact. Right. But what we do is we find the heart of the matter. Is that it's some people will call it a thesis, but it's really just the heart of the thing.
That's right.
And I felt your heart from the very beginning is summed up in those two pillars of here's the truth and here's the truth.
Right.
And it's really up to you to decide. But the minute that you take away one of those pillars and pretends like it's not there,
that's right.
No one's going to be able to make the proper decision.
That's right. I thought it's a big, messy story.
It is a big, messy story that you presented as cleanly as possible.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
So let's look at some of the questions that your fans have. Can you answer one that I particularly want to know the answer to? From Constance asks, what's with these German scientists? Were they so much better than American scientists that we really needed to go scarf them up?
At the time, some of them were, particularly Von Braun. Goddard had already had success in the United States with rockets, but the V2 was the first rocket ship. It was the first such vehicle to scrape the edge of space. And he was at least 20 years. The Germans were at least 20 years ahead of every other nation in the world when it came to rocket engineering. And I think it's also worth considering, and I talk about this in the book. If the Americans didn't accept von Braun, what if the Russians had? And what if he had gone there and built all of these things for the Soviet side? And so I think all of these complexities were playing into that decision to eventually immigrate him to the United States.
Or what if Korolev had actually gone to the United States instead,
Yeah.
and been allowed the freedom and the financial backing of the United States? Could he have been successful? While von Braun, if he'd gone to Russia, would have been bound by the propaganda that Khrushchev was, he was all about making a splash instead of making progress scientifically.
Yeah. He wanted, Khrushchev wanted defense for the Soviet Union above all else. If Korolev could enhance Russian prestige with these space spectaculars, then he was fine with that. But I think, it's worth considering that both of these men were brilliant in their own right. But it was also about money. Von Braun wanted to come to the United States because he knew that's where the money was. And he knew even then that it was going to take money as much as rocket fuel to get us to the moon. And so, I think that was a big part of the story that I also want young readers to see. We talk so much about, defense budgets. And I remember when I was 13, the age of the reader of this book. And I didn't connect with that. I didn't think what it means for a country to have a budget. But when you look, especially a military budget, when you look at the billions of dollars that we spend on defense, and comparatively how little we spend on space travel, or space exploration, there's a really complicated intersection there between, our American identity and our American bottom line.
Here's a quick Q&A for you. I'm going to give you both of these at the same time. As you're doing your research, did you ever watch For All Mankind while you're watching it? And also, were you influenced by The Right Stuff, the book, Tom Wolf?
Yeah, I love The Right Stuff. It is one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books. And Tom Wolf, he was sort of the original narrative nonfiction writer. And that book is just a delight to read. The language, it has this propulsive, that whole book feels like a rocket rumbling on the launch pad before it takes off. So I've read The Right Stuff many times. I actually really love the 4-hour-long movie from the 1980s too, which is just so kitschy and cool. If you've never watched it, it's worth the 4-hour investment. As for All Mankind, yes, I did watch it. Fortunately, I had wrapped up all of my research and I was well into just polishing the book at that point. But I was really curious to see how they were going to portray von Braun and if they were going to talk about Korolev at all. And I don't remember him being mentioned in any significant way. And I think when the season 2 of the series starts in the next couple of weeks, it's the 1980s. And Korolev died in the 1960s. So it seems like Korolev once again has just sort of slipped, between the pages of history, which is such a shame because his life was absolutely fascinating. And we wouldn't have had a space race if it hadn't been for Korolev. He kicked off the whole thing. He masterminded, the Soyuz rocket and space capsule. And, until the Falcon 9 came online, and I think we're still actually taking off. Americans are taking off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in a rocket. that Korolov originally conceived of, like the 1950s and 60s.
Right, yeah.
So it's not like he's unimportant. He's just invisible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lessons learned about how the difference, in how we approach history. And
Yeah.
he was a secret from the very beginning. His name, he was not meant to be known.
Yeah.
And
After Sputnik, the Nobel Committee wanted to award him the Nobel Prize, but his government said no, A, because his identity was a state secret, and B, because in the Soviet Union, Korolov was not an individual. He just belonged to Mother Russia, and the accomplishment belonged to them as well.
How about this? Here's a simple one. I know you have like 3 picture books coming out about nature.
Yeah.
And you got one, I know it's called Good Night, Little Bookstore.
That's right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
From Candlewick Press, I understand.
That's right.
We'll be
familiar there.
Pressmates there.
Yeah, that's right.
Tell us about your 2 books coming out. And
yeah, I have a couple of books coming out. One is coming out in September. It's a picture book for much younger readers than In the Shadow of the Moon, preschool to early elementary school. And it is about all of the fascinating structures that animals build in nature, from beehives and beaver dams to a snail that lives on the ocean floor and collects shells and coral and attaches them to his existing shell so that he looks very intimidating and hard to chew. That's one of his survival mechanisms. So I'm really looking forward to that book. There's a companion to Animal Architects that will publish in 2022, and it is called, it was originally called Animal Superheroes, but I've changed it to Animal Superpowers. And it's all about animals who, I kid you not, have legitimate superpowers. There's a shrimp that fires weaponized bubbles at his enemies, or at predators. And this is why I write nonfiction and about the natural world. You could never make this stuff up. I always say I'd rather look it up than make it up. And that's, it's just fascinating. And then I have another book coming out in 2022 called Good Night Little Bookstore. It's a love letter to, malaprops and independent bookstores like Malaprops everywhere. That's all about us, how we close the bookstore at night, saying goodnight to the bookstore, sort of tucking the bookstore into bed. And that project's really near and dear to my heart. 3 much more lighthearted subjects than the hidden history of the space race.
You like the challenge of going back and forth?
I do. It's really it's satisfying, and it's also it feels healthier to have a foothold in something a little lighter. I've been reading about Nazis and rockets for the 3.5 years now, and I'm fascinated. But it's a very dark, scary period of history, and having those books, they're like little life rafts that I can escape to a day or 2 out of the week. So it makes for a nice balance.
I feel you.
Yeah. Yeah, really. Cannibalism and you guys have to read The Snow Fell 3 Graves Deep. This book is phenomenal.
And now I got a picture book coming out for like 5 years.
I know, I'm so excited about that one too. It's going to be great.
It's
that
awesome.
Launch, let's remind everybody. Nobody Like a Book, February 12th at 6 p.m.
Yep.
RSVP. You've got one back there?
Right there.
That art. Oh, it's so beautiful, Allan.
It's all about the relationship between the reader and the book, because without innovation comes from the imagination and the information that you bring to it.
That's right.
There's a little research angle in there. Right.
I see what you did there.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Always. We're so excited for that book.
Well, I'm excited about this book.
Thank you.
I'm honored that I got to read it before just about anybody else did. And I learned a whole lot from this book, and
I'm
I'll
glad.
never
I
take
really
that for
appreciate
granted
it.
again.
Yeah.
So
Thank you so
kudos
much,
to
Allan.
you.
This was great. So grateful to you. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you
This has
all
been
so
wonderful.
much. Amy, if you ever want to just read to us some more on the side, please do, because it was fantastic. Your audio
Thank you.
side career awaits you. And I want to thank you and Allan for being here and talking in such a enlightening way about a book that I think is not only just timely, but as someone who, like you, grew up during the Cold War, we lived it, but that doesn't mean we understood it. And so
That's right.
You're helping us really understand that and bring that history to young people and to adults as well. And I'm so grateful for that. And congratulations on
Thank you.
these the new books that are coming out. You and
you.
Allan just keep bringing them, and then when the pandemic's over, we got to get some roller skating in there, because that's right, people. We know how to roll. Us roller.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. Can't wait.
I can't wait either. Congratulations, Amy, on In the Shadow of the Moon. I'm delighted to have been here to listen to this wonderful conversation. And please, everyone, support your independent bookstores. Allan's latest book, The Snow Fell 3 Graves Deep. And then his book event is this Friday, so you can sign up for that. And Amy has got her books coming out. Stephanie has been so helpful and does such a wonderful job, our director of author events behind the scenes this evening, running the chat and helping us click on the links and know where we are. So thank you again, Amy. Thank you, Allan. Good night, everyone. Support your local independent bookstores.
Yes.